The B-17 pilot who saved 5 starving Japanese women from execution, and they never let him go. The smoke rose from the clearing like the last breath of a dying world, and through it I could see 5 women kneeling in the red earth, trembling not just from fear, but from the hunger that had consumed their bodies until only bones remained covered by translucent skin and clothes that had once been white. The B-17 shuddered around me like a wounded animal, flying too low to be safe, too low to be wise, but too high to stop what was about to happen in the jungle below. 12 fanatic soldiers stood in a semicircle around the women, rifles raised, barrels gleaming in the filtered sunlight that managed to penetrate the canopy overhead. I could smell the smoke even at 500 feet, acrid and wrong, carrying the stench of burning villages and something else, desperation, the metallic tang of impending execution, the sulfur of a world where mercy had been buried under months of starvation and madness. My co-pilot Johnson was screaming coordinates into the radio, trying to reach anyone who could authorize what I was about to do, but the static crackled back empty and meaningless. The women looked up at our aircraft with eyes that had seen too much, hollow sockets that reflected not hope, but simply the acknowledgement that death was finally coming for them. And in that moment, I saw my sister's face in each of theirs, saw my mother's hands in their trembling fingers, saw every woman I had ever loved reduced to skin and bone and terror. The bomb bay doors groaned open, and the B-17's siren began to wail, a sound designed to terrify enemy ground troops, and I watched those soldiers scatter like insects when the kitchen light comes on. But the women remained kneeling, too weak to run, too broken to understand that salvation might be diving toward them at 200 miles per hour. Naquele segundo, quando elas olharam para mim como se eu fosse o último ser humano que restava, eu soube que minha vida nunca mais seria minha sozinho. Before I tell you what happened next, subscribe and stay with me. Some memories shouldn't die alone. To understand how I ended up in that impossible moment, we need to go back to a wheat farm outside Topeka, Kansas, where a 12-year-old boy first heard the thunder of aircraft engines and decided that his future lay somewhere above the clouds. My father worked the land, but I worked the sky, spending every afternoon flat on my back in the tall grass, watching training flights from nearby airfields cut across the endless horizon like mechanical prayers. The sound they made wasn't just noise. It was possibility, freedom, the promise that a farm boy could touch the heavens if he was willing to risk everything. When Pearl Harbor burned on December 7, 1941, I was 17 and heartbroken that the war might end before I was old enough to join it. By 1943, I was at flight training school in Texas, learning to pilot the most beautiful killing machine America had ever built. The B-17 Flying Fortress was poetry written in aluminum and steel, a 10-man cathedral that could carry democracy across oceans and deliver it with precision that bordered on divine intervention. Training taught us to think in formations, to breathe in oxygen percentages and fuel ratios, to navigate by dead reckoning across waters that stretched beyond the limits of human comprehension. We learned to love the weight of responsibility, the knowledge that strategic bombing could end wars before they consumed entire generations, that precision applied at altitude could accomplish what ground forces might need years to achieve. The instructors were men who had flown over Europe, who had seen cities disappear beneath their bomb loads and lived with the mathematics of warfare, the calculation that destroying an aircraft factory today meant saving 1,000 Allied soldiers tomorrow. But nothing in training prepared us for the reality of the Pacific theater, where the war had evolved beyond conventional strategy into something darker, more desperate, more personally brutal than anything our doctrine had anticipated. When I arrived at Henderson Field in April 1945, assigned to the 11th Bombardment Group, the Japanese Empire was starving itself to death rather than surrender, and that hunger was creating atrocities that challenged every assumption we held about human nature and the rules of warfare. Intelligence reports described mass executions of civilians who attempted to surrender, family murders committed by fathers who preferred death to the shame of defeat, entire villages that chose collective suicide over foreign occupation. The war had become a contest between two definitions of honor, and the Japanese version seemed determined to include every man, woman, and child in its final calculation. The briefings painted a picture of an enemy that had moved beyond military logic into pure fanaticism, where survival itself was considered betrayal and death had become the only acceptable response to defeat. Reconnaissance flights reported movement patterns that suggested massive population displacement, civilians fleeing toward the mountains and deep jungle areas where they could avoid both American occupation and Japanese execution squads that were eliminating anyone suspected of defeatist sympathies. Women and children were disappearing from coastal areas in numbers that couldn't be explained by conventional evacuation procedures, creating refugee populations that existed in a gray zone between military and humanitarian concern. Our intelligence officers suspected these displaced populations were being systematically eliminated by extremist units that viewed civilian survival as fundamentally incompatible with national honor. The mission on May 15, 1945, was supposed to be routine reconnaissance, photograph suspected supply routes in the mountainous interior of Luzon, gather intelligence on troop movements that might indicate preparations for final resistance operations. What we found instead was a landscape emptied of normal human activity, where villages that should have contained thousands of civilians showed no signs of life beyond cooking fires that burned without anyone tending them. The jungle had swallowed entire populations, absorbing them so completely that only smoke rising from hidden clearings suggested any continuing human presence. We were flying a search pattern over terrain that looked empty from altitude but felt heavy with invisible watchers, as if the forest itself was evaluating our presence and finding us wanting. At 14:27 hours, we spotted the clearing, a perfect circle cut from jungle so thick that creating it must have taken weeks of work. From 2,000 feet, it looked like any other enemy encampment, but as we descended for closer observation, the details became clear and horrifying. 12 soldiers wearing the armbands of one of the fanatical resistance groups were arranged in formation around 5 women who had been forced to kneel in the center of the space, their hands bound behind their backs, their faces turned upward toward our aircraft as if they were praying to the sky for deliverance that would never come. The women were so thin that their bones showed through their skin like anatomical diagrams, their clothes hanging loose as burial shrouds, their hair falling out in patches that suggested malnutrition so severe it had reached the point where their bodies were consuming themselves to survive. The soldiers raised their rifles in perfect synchronization, a drill they had practiced enough times to perform with mechanical precision, and in that moment I understood that we were witnessing not combat, but execution, not warfare, but murder, not strategy, but the systematic elimination of witnesses to Japan's final agony. These women had committed no crime beyond surviving when their empire wanted them dead, beyond choosing life when their culture demanded death, beyond hoping for rescue when their government had declared hope itself a form of treason. They looked up at our B-17 with eyes that had given up on salvation, but still retained enough humanity to acknowledge the presence of other human beings, even if those humans could do nothing to change their fate. I didn't think. Thinking would have required authorization, would have demanded consideration of mission parameters and rules of engagement and political implications that extended far beyond what was happening in that clearing. Instead, I acted on instinct that went deeper than training, older than military doctrine, more fundamental than any allegiance to flag or country or cause. I pushed the B-17's nose down until we were screaming toward the clearing, at an angle that violated every principle of safe flying, opened the bomb bay doors to activate our siren system, and began firing warning shots from our nose-mounted machine guns into the tree line around the clearing. The effect was immediate and chaotic. The soldiers scattered in every direction, abandoning their execution formation to seek cover from what they assumed was an incoming bombing run. The women remained kneeling, too weak to run, too broken to understand that the thunder overhead might represent salvation rather than simply a different form of death. I pulled the B-17 out of its dive at the last possible moment, feeling the aircraft shudder with stress that pushed our airframe beyond design specifications, and began searching for anywhere flat enough to attempt a landing. Johnson was screaming into the radio about unauthorized engagement with enemy forces, but his words were lost in the roar of engines and the hammering of my heart as I realized I had just committed myself to a course of action that would either save 5 lives or get my entire crew killed in an attempt that violated every regulation in the military handbook. The beach was barely 400 yards long, more coral than sand, bordered by rocks that could destroy our landing gear and end our rescue attempt before it began. I brought the B-17 down harder than any landing should be, feeling the aircraft bounce and skid and finally slide to a stop less than 50 feet from the waterline. Before the engines stopped turning, I was out of my seat, grabbing my sidearm and as much emergency rations as I could carry, leaving Johnson to maintain radio contact while I attempted something that had no precedent in my training or experience. The jungle was less than 100 yards away, and somewhere in that green darkness, 5 women were waiting to die unless I could reach them before their executioners regrouped and completed their interrupted mission. The trek through the jungle took 23 minutes that felt like hours, following game trails and stream beds toward the sound of voices that grew louder as I approached the clearing. When I finally reached the edge of the open space, the scene had changed completely. The soldiers were gone, vanished into the forest like smoke, but the women remained exactly where I had seen them, from the air, still kneeling, still bound, still waiting for death, with the patience of people who had been waiting for months. They looked up when I emerged from the tree line, and what I saw in their eyes wasn't relief or gratitude or hope. It was simple recognition of another human being in a world that had forgotten what humanity meant. I approached slowly, my hands visible, speaking in the few words of Japanese I had learned from intelligence briefings, trying to communicate that I was there to help rather than harm. They watched me, with the wariness of animals that had been hunted for so long that kindness had become incomprehensible. But when I knelt to cut their bonds, they didn't resist or try to escape. Their wrists were rubbed raw from rope that had been tied too tight for too long, their hands so thin that the rope had cut grooves into flesh that barely covered bone. When the last binding fell away, they remained motionless for a moment, as if freedom was a concept they had forgotten how to process. Then the youngest, she couldn't have been more than 16, reached out with trembling fingers and touched my face, her eyes wide with amazement that I was real, that I was warm, that I was human rather than simply another hallucination brought on by starvation and despair. The others followed her example, reaching out to touch my hands, my arms, my uniform, confirming through physical contact that rescue had actually arrived, that someone had chosen to risk everything to prevent their execution. When I stood and gestured for them to follow me, they rose as one and arranged themselves behind me like a formation, staying close enough that they could maintain physical contact, as if letting go might cause me to disappear back into the dream from which they had imagined me. "You are safe now," I told them in English, knowing they probably couldn't understand the words, but hoping they could read the intention in my voice. While I breathe, you are safe. And in that moment, watching them cling to each other and to the hope I represented, I felt the weight of 5 lives settling onto my shoulders like a burden I would carry for the rest of my days. They had looked at me as if I were the last human being in a world full of monsters, and I had made them a promise that would define every choice I made from that day forward. The journey back to the beach revealed the extent of their condition. They could barely walk, stumbling over roots and rocks that should have been simple obstacles, stopping every few minutes to rest because their bodies no longer had the strength for sustained movement. The oldest, a woman who might have been 30 but looked 50, fell twice before we reached the aircraft, and each time the others helped her up with a gentleness that spoke of months spent caring for each other when no one else would. They had formed their own family in the jungle, their own survival unit, bound together by shared suffering and mutual dependence. And my arrival hadn't just saved 5 individuals, it had preserved an entire community that existed nowhere else in the world. Johnson had the engines running when we reached the B-17, and his expression when he saw me emerge from the jungle with 5 emaciated Japanese women told me everything I needed to know about how our superiors would receive my unauthorized rescue operation. But the women's reaction to seeing the aircraft up close was worth whatever disciplinary action awaited me. They had heard B-17s flying overhead for months, symbols of American power that had brought nothing but destruction to their world. But now they were looking at one of those machines as salvation, as sanctuary, as the vehicle that would carry them away from a jungle that had become a killing field for anyone who chose survival over death. Getting them aboard required careful assistance. They were too weak to climb unaided, too fragile to be lifted roughly, too frightened to be rushed through an operation that must have seemed like entering the belly of a mechanical beast. I helped each one individually, making sure they understood that the noise and vibration were normal, that the cramped quarters were temporary, that the men around them were protectors rather than captors. They clustered together in the radio operator's compartment, holding hands in a chain that connected all 5 of them to each other and to the hope that had pulled them back from the edge of death. Tell me where you're watching from. It helps keep these stories alive. The flight back to Henderson Field was the longest hour of my life. The women sat in complete silence, not from fear, but from exhaustion so complete that they lacked the energy for any response beyond simple breathing. I could see them in the reflection of my instruments, huddled together like survivors of a shipwreck who had finally found a life raft, but weren't yet convinced it would actually carry them to safety. Every few minutes, one of them would reach out to touch another, confirming through physical contact that they were all still there, still alive, still together in whatever came next. The youngest kept staring at me through the cockpit opening, her eyes wide with an intensity that suggested she was memorizing every detail of my appearance, as if she needed to be able to recognize me in a crowd of thousands. Landing at Henderson Field created the crisis I had been dreading since the moment I decided to interfere with that execution. Military police were waiting when we taxied to our parking area, and behind them stood officers whose expressions made it clear that my unauthorized rescue operation had created problems that extended far beyond simple violation of mission parameters. The women understood immediately that something was wrong. They had lived through too many encounters with hostile authority to miss the signs of an approaching confrontation. When the MPs approached the aircraft, the women moved closer together, forming a protective circle around the youngest, preparing to face whatever new threat had emerged from their temporary sanctuary. But they also did something that changed everything. The oldest woman, who had barely spoken during our entire journey, stood up despite her weakness and positioned herself between the MPs and the other women. Then she reached back and took my hand, pulling me forward to stand beside her, making it clear through gesture and positioning that they considered me part of their family now, that whatever happened to them would happen to all of us together. The other four followed her example, arranging themselves around me in a formation that declared their loyalty and dependence in terms that required no translation. I had become their protector, but they had also become my responsibility, and that relationship would survive whatever bureaucratic obstacles our governments might place in its path. The interrogation lasted 3 days. Intelligence officers wanted to know why I had abandoned my mission to rescue enemy civilians, what intelligence value these women might represent, how their presence on a US military base could be justified or explained. The women, meanwhile, refused to eat unless I was present, refused to sleep unless they could see me, refused to cooperate with any questioning that didn't include my participation. They had attached themselves to me with a completeness that went beyond gratitude into something approaching imprinting, as if I had become the single fixed point in a world that had revealed itself to be entirely unreliable. Medical examination revealed the extent of their ordeal. Malnutrition so severe it had affected their bone density, dehydration that had damaged their kidneys, psychological trauma that manifested as hypervigilance, and an inability to remain alone for more than a few minutes at a time. The doctors estimated they had been surviving on less than 500 calories per day for at least 3 months, supplementing inadequate food with whatever they could forage from a jungle that was itself starving. They had kept each other alive through careful rationing, shared warmth, and a collective determination that none of them would die alone. My intervention had saved not just 5 lives, but an entire support system that had proved more effective than any military unit in maintaining morale and cohesion under impossible conditions. The crisis came on the 4th day, when orders arrived transferring the women to a civilian displacement camp, where they could receive proper medical care and eventually be repatriated to whatever remained of Japanese civil authority. The women understood immediately what the orders meant. Separation from the one person they trusted, return to a system that had already tried to kill them once, abandonment by the protector who had promised they would remain safe while he breathed. Their reaction was immediate and heartbreaking. They clung to me with desperate strength they didn't possess, sobbing with voices too weak to make much sound, but powerful enough to express despair that needed no translation. The youngest wrapped her arms around my legs and would not let go, her entire body trembling with exhaustion and terror at the thought of being abandoned again. Another pressed her forehead against my chest and whispered words in Japanese that I didn't understand but could feel in my heart. Words that sounded like prayers, like promises, like the last requests of someone who knew she was about to die. The oldest took my face in her hands and stared into my eyes with an intensity that conveyed everything she couldn't say in my language. Gratitude for salvation, terror at separation, acceptance that this was how their story would end, with another abandonment by another system that viewed their survival as inconvenient. I fought the orders through every channel available to me, appealing to commanding officers who saw only administrative complications, requesting assistance from chaplains who acknowledged the moral dimension but lacked the authority to override military regulations, seeking help from medical personnel who understood the psychological trauma but couldn't justify indefinite retention of enemy civilians on a combat base. The bureaucracy was immovable, inflexible, designed to process problems rather than solve them, and these 5 women had become a problem that defied existing categories and solutions. But they never let me go. Not really. Even when the military police came to escort them to the transport aircraft that would take them away from Henderson Field and back into a system that had already failed them once. They maintained physical contact with me until the last possible moment. The youngest kept my flight jacket, which I'd given her when she was shivering in the aircraft, clutching it like a security blanket that contained some essential part of me she could take with her into whatever came next. Another kept a photograph from my wallet, a picture of my family back home in Kansas that she had asked for, with gestures that transcended language barriers and cultural differences. When the aircraft engines started and they were finally forced to let go of me, their faces remained turned toward me until the transport disappeared over the horizon. 5 pairs of eyes that continued to hold mine across distance and separation and the fundamental impossibility of their situation. I had saved them from execution in a jungle clearing, but I couldn't save them from a world that had no place for enemy civilians who had chosen American rescue over Japanese honor. They were returning to a system that might view their survival as collaboration, their rescue as betrayal, their choice of life over death as fundamentally unpatriotic. The war ended 3 months later, but I never learned what happened to them. Intelligence reports mentioned civilian displacement camps and repatriation operations, but individual cases were lost in the massive bureaucratic operation required to process millions of Japanese civilians who had survived the final collapse of their empire. I searched through Red Cross records and military files, wrote letters to occupation authorities and refugee organizations, but 5 emaciated women who had been rescued by an unauthorized operation that violated standard procedures had disappeared into the administrative void that swallows inconvenient truths and irregular actions. But they never let me go, not in the ways that matter. 47 years later, I still wake up some mornings expecting to find them clustered around my bed, holding hands in the chain formation that kept them connected to each other and to hope when everything else had been stripped away. I still reach for extra rations when I pack for trips, still look for faces in crowds that might belong to women who would now be in their 70s, still carry the weight of 5 lives that I saved but couldn't protect, that I rescued but couldn't keep safe, that I pulled back from the edge of death but couldn't deliver to a world that would treat them with the dignity they had earned through their survival. They never let me go, not in memory, not in dreams, not in the part of my conscience that remains forever kneeling in that jungle clearing, promising safety to women who had every reason to distrust promises, offering protection to people who had already been abandoned by every system that should have defended them. I can still feel their hands touching my face with amazement that rescue had actually come, can still hear their whispered words in a language I couldn't understand but didn't need translated, can still see their eyes in the faces of every person who looks at the world with the wariness of someone who has learned that survival requires constant vigilance and mutual protection. Some promises transcend the circumstances that create them, extending beyond the immediate moment into something permanent and binding that shapes every choice that follows. When I told those 5 women they were safe while I breathed, I was making a commitment that had no expiration date, accepting responsibility that couldn't be transferred or delegated or forgotten when the bureaucracy moved them out of my reach. They are still with me, still holding hands in that formation that kept them alive through months of starvation and terror, still trusting that somewhere in the world there is at least one person who remembers their names and carries their story and refuses to let them disappear into the administrative silence that swallows inconvenient acts of human decency. If you want more stories from the sky, subscribe. These memories deserve witnesses.